For those of you who are with us today, I know, Gilly, this is your first time with us. A couple of other names that I don't remember, but just to give you a context of why we chose that poem and what we're hoping to do in the next few weeks is this amazing book that wandered into my life at such a time as this, The Five Invitations. Because I don't want to butcher his name, I'm going to always refer to him as Frank. But it is an incredible book, and welcome on this journey with us through the Five Invitations. And let me start with another very short poem, this time by the Sufi mystic and writer Hafiz. I know many of you are so familiar with his work. And these are Hafiz's words. The subject tonight is love. And for tomorrow night as well. As a matter of fact, I know of no better topic for us to discuss until we die. So in that context, we'll be looking very briefly at three different parts of the second invitation, and they go like this. The first one is about love and the healing power of love. The second one is the concept of as is. And the third is turn towards. Frank talks about the power or the healing power of love. And he says that when someone believes that they are beyond love, you can't convince them to love themselves, but you can show them and you can remind them. And his book, not just this second chapter, but the entire book is filled with examples of the way Frank and his team showed love to people in the hospice, the Zen hospice that he founded and still runs, actually. Love in action is the Buddhist principle, metta. And he reminds us that love in action is what changes people's lives because, as he said, telling them is not enough, but showing them is transformative. And in that vein, let me share with you a beautiful Irish poet. His name is Galway Kinnell, and he wrote a poem with an extraordinary title. I'm just going to excerpt just a little, but the title is St. Francis and the Sow, as in the pig. But here's an absolute treasure of a verse, and it encapsulates this very idea. It says, the bud on a tree, the bud stands for all things, even for those things that don't flower. For everything flowers, but from within, of self-blessing. Though sometimes it is necessary to re-teach a thing its loveliness. I want to repeat that. Sometimes it is necessary to re-teach a thing its loveliness. To put a hand on its brow of the flower and retell it in words and in touch that it is lovely, until it flowers again from within of self-blessing. Now, something that Frank talks about a lot in this chapter is that love is not an exterior thing, but an interior from within. And he quotes, and I'd like to share with you also another great Irish poet. I'm sure everyone here knows his name and knows his work, the beautiful, incomparable John O'Donoghue. And John wrote this: "We do not need to go out and find love. Rather, we need to be still and let love discover us. If you try to view yourself through the lenses that others offer you, all you will see are distortions. Your own light and beauty will become blurred, awkward, and ugly. So let love discover us." As we know, love heals. It's always available to us, even if we don't believe it. And it dissolves defenses, confusion, unresolved losses, any sense of separation. Very often, and I struggle with it in my own life, that armor that we all have to, or feel that we have to wear in life, in fact, cuts us off from love and tenderness and mercy. And we become quite isolated and frightened, or can indeed, but living behind that shield. But love is what opens us up into that spaciousness. And the truth is, as I said earlier, we're never separated from it. I love that Frank said in his book, love is not a gated community. Isn't that wonderful? Love is not a gated community. And in Zen, they do believe that no part is left out. No part is left out. Love, he said, just breeds more love. Now, it's interesting that he waits until this point in the book to tell you of his own story. And it's something that I think will resonate with so many of us and those that we know in our lives and in our communities, even our families. His was actually a story of great sadness, growing up with two alcoholic parents and abused, I think, over a 5-year period by a priest. And he did what so many do, myself included, and he buried it. And of course, as we know, burying resolves nothing. And he talks about how his journey from that point of buriedness to being able to let love discover him was really the beginning of his life's work. He said that one day I felt somebody would come and rescue me. But actually, as it turned out, it was the opposite. And he explains that in the chapter, that it is in fact the opposite. It doesn't come to us. It comes, as he says, through us. I was rescued, he said, when love came through me and from me. And that started when he was, he'd finished college and he began helping disabled children. And he said it was in that service, it was working with the vulnerable and the needy and those who felt, because of their disfigurements, whatever they may be, themselves unlovely, that unlocked a compassion deep within him that helped him eventually overcome his own suffering. And he discovered through that compassion a vast, essential, reliable, and get this, undamaged love. Undamaged love. He said, love taught me love. And it allows us to move beyond that which we believe is impossible. And if you listen to him, and I would encourage you to go online, there's some beautiful short talks that he gives and interviews. And when you see him as the man he is now, and a man in his later years, just obviously a product of his journey and his beautiful Zen practice, he exudes this very thing of love. The second thing he talks about is the concept as is. As is. He introduces it by sharing a story of how he and his daughter loved to go thrifting. They would go to secondhand stores and try and find cool clothing and accessories, which of course are usually a fraction of the original price. And he said while his daughter was trying on a dress in the changing room, he was just flicking through the racks and he saw an old leather jacket. And obviously it had been much loved and well worn. And the ticket on the jacket said $9.95 as is. And he said, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could just place that label on everything, including ourselves, as is, just to accept as is. Now, he makes a very important point that I wanted to share because I think it is important, and that is acceptance is not resignation. Rather, he says, it's an opening. It's an opening to possibility. And as I was reading the chapter, I was thinking of that amazing Japanese concept of wabi-sabi. I don't know if any of you know it. I know that there are a lot of artists amongst us. But for those of you who don't know, let me just share very quickly. Wabi-sabi is the Jewish, maybe Jewish as well, but Japanese understanding that imperfection is beauty. And it's part of the beauty. It's what defines the beauty. It's what makes the beauty unique. And so, of course, what they do is they will take a piece of wood that has a knot running through it, or a cup that has been cracked, and they highlight it. In other words, to highlight the imperfection and to really draw attention to the as is of anything. And I thought, well, we too are similar to the table that's made of the plank with the knot in it or the cracked cup. And to really embrace wabi-sabi in our own lives and thereby, I think, be able to embrace it in others. For those of you who aren't sure of the spelling, it's W-A-B-I-S-A-B-I, wabi-sabi, 2 words. As is. And it reminded me of a story, another Zen story, and I'm sure some of you may have heard it before, about the farmer and his son. And the farmer and his son had a beloved horse who helped the family earn a living. And one day, the horse ran away, and the neighbors exclaimed, "Oh, your horse has run away! What terrible luck!" And the farmer replied, "Maybe so, maybe not." Now, of course, I would like to interject here, welcome everything, push away nothing, as is. A few days later, the horse returned home, and in fact, didn't come back alone, but rather was leading a few other wild horses back to the farm as well. And the neighbors shouted to the farmer, "Oh, your horse has returned and brought several horses with him. What great luck!" And the farmer replied, "Maybe so, maybe not. Welcome everything, push away nothing, as is. Later that week, the farmer's son was trying to break in one of the wild horses, and the horse threw him to the ground and his leg was severely broken. The neighbors cried, "Oh, your son broke his leg. What terrible luck." The farmer said, "Maybe so, maybe not." Or, "Welcome everything, push away nothing, as is." And a few weeks later, soldiers from the National Army marched through the town, recruiting all young men for the army. But they didn't take the farmer's son because he had a broken leg. And the neighbors shouted, "Ah, your boy is spared. What tremendous luck." To which, of course, the farmer said, "Maybe so, maybe not. Welcome everything, push away nothing, as is." And the final part of this extraordinary chapter is what I mentioned earlier, concept of turning towards. And let me explain more about what I mean. Frank reminds us that a rejected experience in our lives, and I know that we all know this, myself very much included, the rejected experience will keep showing up. And as he says, we waste our energies and exhaust ourselves with an insistence that things be otherwise. Suffering, he said, is exacerbated by avoidance. It's what he called, and I love this, undigested pain. And of course, from the Buddhist perspective, pain is inevitable, suffering is optional. And he talks about an old Pali. Now, Pali is one of the ancient languages, very much like Sanskrit. And the old Pali word is dukkha, D-U-K-K-A, dukkha, which means anguish, suffering, wanting not to cultivate awareness, a turning away rather than a turning towards. And so Frank says it's simple arithmetic. Pain plus resistance equals suffering. He talked about as a child when he was playing with a pocket knife and he got a bit too vigorous and whoosh, sliced his hand. And he was, of course, as any young boy would be, scared by how much blood was coming out. He ran to his mother, who said, "Let's wrap a magic towel around it to try and stem the bleeding." And of course, it was underneath the towel, and he was inconsolable. And after he'd calmed down, his mother said, "Shall we take a look at it?" And he said, it was when the towel came off and he actually looked at the wound and realized that it wasn't as bad as he thought it was. That in this moment, it became a teaching for him that remained throughout his life. The secret, of course, being that the healing and the secret of healing lies in exploring our wounds, looking at them, engaging with them to see, well, what's really there? So he asks us to turn towards the difficulties that we face and to see what does it have to teach us. You remember that I shared with you last time we were together about the telephone pole installers who always said, "Don't run away from the falling pole, but run towards it. It's the only way to stop greater damage." Now, as you know, I grew up and I spent my teenage years in England. And there was, I don't know if any of you know the sort of the post-punk era. It was my time. And there was a band that I loved called Skunk and Nancy. And the singer was this beautiful, originally come from the Caribbean, queer woman, bald head, very striking looking. I just adored her. And her name is Skin. And Skin was interviewed, and I remember listening to Skin's story during lockdown. So this is when I was in Amsterdam, and it was something that landed so profoundly with me. And I thought, Skin's story encapsulate this very teaching exactly. Now, Skin was living in an area, South London, called Brixton. And in her era, Brixton was very funky, very cool. It was the home of reggae and the home of everything that was musical and artistic. And she lived in a small apartment. And one day she'd been at this great gig and she was walking back alone because she didn't live very far away from the venue. And she was followed. And she said she realized she was being followed, so she sped up, and the guy behind her also sped up. And then she started to run and realized to her horror that the guy behind her was also running. And she ran to her house to try to escape him, and then he ran up the steps behind her and attacked her. She screamed and shouted and thankfully pushed him away, and he disappeared off into the night. Well, days later, while she's walking through the markets in Brixton, she sees him again. And so she alerts the police, and they have him arrested, and they're in court, and it becomes a case of his story versus hers. He gets off, but now, of course, he knows where she lives. And she said for months, he tormented her. He would come up, she'd be in random places, and he would come up and say, "I know where you live." And she said she went from being this tall, powerful, energetic, vibrant person. She just became diminished and scared. And she stopped going out. You can imagine the story. She said a few months later, it happened again. She was out walking past Brixton Underground Station, and a voice came behind her, "I know where you live." And she started to walk away, and she was cowering. And as she walked away, she was repeating, "I know where you live. I know where you live. I know where you live." And then she thought, wait a second. He knows where I live, and I've actually become a prisoner. And as she was walking, she became and engaged with it. She became enraged. And she thought, how dare he? How dare he take away my liberties, my freedom? And she said it, there was a moment where she was so enraged, she turned around and raced back towards him. And when she did, she started to shout at him and yell at him and say to him, "How dare you do this? And how dare, and I know you do this." And she's shouting and screaming and hollering. And guess what? He ran away. He ran away. And she never saw him again. And she said that this was the moment that she not only found her voice, but she also found that which was lying inside, which was, I want to be an artist. I want to be a singer. I want to have the courage to go and be who I am and what I want to do in the world. And that's exactly what happened. And she said that was the turning point for her, the turning around, running towards, facing, and confronting. Such a powerful story. Before I close, I want to share with you two other brief stories. The one is something I've learned quite recently, and that is that in the time in Jerusalem during the Second Temple, it was common for people to go on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. They would go up the steps of the Temple Mount, enter its huge plaza, and they would turn right and circle the temple counterclockwise. Meanwhile, and get this, the broken-hearted, the mourners, those suffering in some way would turn to the left and circle in the opposite direction. And each person encountering someone walking in the other direction would pause and stop and say, "What happened?" And then the person who was struggling would say. And those who had listened would say, and this was the blessing that they were to give them, "May the Holy One comfort you. You are not alone. May the Holy One comfort you. You are not alone." This year, they say, you may walk counterclockwise, and next year it might be you who's walking in the opposite direction and walk in the path of the anguished. And what power to say, "I see you, I hold you, I acknowledge you," knowing that one day it might be me. I had an uncomfortable relationship with organized religion. That's a story for another day, except to say that I was so traumatized and put off by church that I stopped going for years and years. And when I was in New York, it was shortly after 9/11. And for those of you who are in and around New York at that time, you remember what that was like. And a lot of people, interestingly enough, were doing a lot of soul searching and spiritual inquiry. And I can't even call it a church, but a new gathering had started. And it was very much like the one we share in terms of it was inclusive and it was it was brave gathering, interfaith gathering. And I remember that my partner at the time was trying to convince me to go, and I was like, "Oh, no, 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 no. I don't do church. I don't do church." And she kept saying to me, "No, no, no, you have to try, you have to try." And eventually I thought, okay, I'll go up, and what I'll do is I'll stand at the back, not by the exit where there was an elevator. And I did just that. I didn't even sit. I just stood in the doorway, leaning against the doorway and listening, and was rather captivated by the speaker and by the music and the people who spoke. So in a way, sort of took the sting out for me. So I went again another Sunday and I did the same thing, leant against the wall and listened. Well, it found that the more that I got engaged, oddly enough, I felt like, you know what, I don't want to stand during a whole service. I think I'll sit. So I found somewhere on the back row and I sat. Well, no surprises, of course, that as each Sunday passed and I would go, I would move further and further and further up the seats until eventually I ended up not only sitting on the front seat, but becoming very involved with the leadership and the work that they were doing. And I thought that it was a powerful indication of how one can turn towards. It's not a sudden thing. It's not an overnight thing, but it's a gradual deciding, a turning towards, and I would like to say, a turning up. The rest, as they say, is history, because here I am with you years later. So in closing, let me just share these final brief ideas and thoughts with you. And that is that Frank says that there are two questions that people who are about to die always ask. Am I loved? And did I love well? And Frank says that taking up these invitations, we'll look at invitation number 3 next time. He said, taking these up is not an act of our will, it's an act of love. And so is an act of love. that we may accept as is, that we may turn towards our suffering, and we may let love come through us and in turn allow it to come to us. Thank you, everybody.
If you like this video, please like us on YouTube, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and click on the bell to be notified whenever we post a new video. Thank you.